Welcome, everyone. We're so happy to have you all here. My name is Teddy Silverman. I'm on the board of National Council of Jewish Women, San Francisco. And this event this evening is planned by our Racial Justice and Diversity Committee. This committee's goals are to learn about Jewish diversity and racial justice. We are trying to educate ourselves and others in the community about racial justice, learn about the history of racism in the country and bias, and we have a focus on social action, on making change, and looking at particularly on police reform. We're really happy to have you all here. And I would like to introduce our esteemed panelists. I'm not going to introduce the panelists, which is an amazing panel, but I'm going to introduce our esteemed moderator, my fellow board member, Lindsay Newman.
Thank you, Teddy. Hi, everyone. I'm Lindsay Newman. I'm also a board member of NCJW San Francisco. And I'm very excited for this evening's panel. We have with us today, I want to share a hearty thank you for all of you for taking the time to teach us and learn with us and have what will hopefully be some really stimulating discussions. So I want to welcome Diana Rosenstein, Chief Attorney at the San Francisco's Department of Police Accountability, Civil Rights Attorney John Burris, and retired Police Chief Susan Mannheimer, formerly of San Mateo and Oakland. So wonderful to see you all. I am going to allow the panelists to introduce themselves with the first question. But I want to first, before we begin, just share a quote that I recently read that I thought was apt for the reason why we, as Teddy said, are focusing on this topic. Oop, there's an echo. Yes, okay, that's better. That we're focusing on this topic as part of our racial justice committee. And so I recently read some thoughts by Harvard University professor Brandon Terry, who said that he thought the best statement of the movement for Black Lives Matter's ideals right now are that the fundamental structure of society itself needs to be rethought. And policing is just one prism through which to do that work. So with that, I will invite first Diana, and then we'll go to John, and then Susan. Please, can you just introduce yourself and your work? Maybe share with us how you define police reform, which is a phrase that people use, but maybe some people use it meaning different things. So what is that? How do you define that? And if you want to share one or two highlights of your police reform work. Please, go ahead, Diana, go ahead.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. I am deeply, deeply honored and humbled to be with you today. I mean, I'm just a little, Jewish immigrant girl from Odessa in the Ukraine, and to sit here before you and be able to have this discussion with you is truly a humbling experience, and I really appreciate having the opportunity to do this. I have been an attorney in San Francisco in public service for San Francisco for 20 years now. I started my career in public service as a public defender in San Francisco, devoted my career to helping indigent individuals seek justice, and then worked at the city attorney's office and am now at the Department of Police Accountability. I was drawn to this particular department because I have always been and had multiple experiences in my life that led me to understand how important police reform and social justice really is. To give you a little bit of background, I grew up in San Francisco, public school education, and then went to UCLA. And in my freshman year at UCLA, came out of the movies one day. I was driving back to campus, and all of the palm trees were set on fire because the verdict in the Rodney King case had just come out. And it was an extremely impactful moment for me. And from that point on, I have always made it my life's work to involve some form of purpose that deals with social justice in my life. I was really excited when Director Henderson, who is the director of the Department of Police Accountability, tapped me in 2018 to come and help him create and revise and reinvigorate the office that was formerly known as Office of Citizens Complaints. And I have been staff attorney and now am the chief, and I have a team of attorneys that I manage. We are deeply involved in civilian oversight of law enforcement in San Francisco, first and foremost with SFPD, but also to some extent currently with the San Francisco Sheriff's Department. Police reform. What does police reform mean to me? Well, I think that police reform for us really requires societal investment and involvement in the ongoing evaluation of police practices. It's really about striking a balance in public safety where the community is involved and evidence-based policing practices are involved. And we end up with a common sense approach to how to efficiently provide law enforcement services in the Bay Area and in the country as a whole. Some things that I think we need to address in order for police reform to really work moving forward are, for example, the effective use of 911. Those are things we need to really look at. Hotspot policing versus intelligence-based policing, and generally changing our police practices in response to the data that we are currently collecting thanks to such governmental agencies as the California Department of Justice, who produces the CalRIPA report, and other data-driven information like that. So that's a little bit about me. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have, and I want to give my co-panelists plenty of time to chat as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Diana. John, please tell us more about yourself and a highlight or two of the work that you've done over many decades. Go ahead. And John, we just need to unmute you.
Thank you. It's always good to be present and engage in discussions around the issues of police reform or policing, because much of what I engage in is the whole issues of how the community is treated by the police, and then how the police treat themselves in many ways in terms of governance. My career has been expansive. I got started, a lot may not know, but I was a law student in Berkeley, and in the summer in the 1970s, I got to work on a police commission, then by then Congressman Ralph Metcalfe, to look into the issues of police brutality. And I spent a summer interviewing victims of beatings by the police, and that sort of captured my soul, if you will. And so I came back to California, and shortly thereafter, I got involved, after becoming a prosecutor for several years, I got involved with a case at the time, high visibility case called Melvin Black, which was a 14-year-old boy who was shot and killed by the Oakland police officers, and sort of a pre-runner of some of the big cases we hear about now. But certainly that was a case that sort of stuck with me, and it caused me to kind of embark upon the areas that I've been involved in. So for the last 40 years or thereabouts, I've been involved in police brutality cases, and many, many cases all throughout the state. I've had every imaginable case, many against the San Francisco Police Department and involving the city attorney's office, and in many other states, many other cities. And so I'm well grounded in the issues, but I will say that despite all the individual cases, I've always thought about cases as an instrument to make the case bigger than what it actually is, and to have an impact on the social dynamics of that particular department, and hopefully bring about an impact so that that particular conduct would not happen in the future. And that's one way of affecting that change now. And that has happened, of course. I've been involved in so many cases that the one that stands out the most in terms of police reform, of course, is the Oakland Rider case that I've been involved in for a good portion of my life now, and that Susan herself participated in a short period of time with. But I will say that I had written a book in the 1990s that was entitled Blue versus Black, Let's End the Conflict Between Cops and Minorities. But at the time, I had in my mind that there's going to come an opportunity where I'm going to affect the department in a major, significant way and bring about reform. And I had sued the Oakland Police Department any number of times before the Riders case happened in 2000. And I clearly saw that it was an opportunity for me to have a dramatic impact in terms of reform. And what that meant to me, with the conduct that they were engaged in, that conduct is going to stop, and that there's going to be things in place to curtail that conduct from occurring in the future, and that there would be some degree of accountability from it. Well, I've been involved in that case for a long time, and I've had some other examples of trying to bring about reform in other departments. And it's always about stopping the conduct that's involved and changing the culture if possible to that culture that says that this is not permissible conduct, and there's accountability that comes with that. And that's extraordinarily important. Now, of course, in terms of highlight cases, of course, the Rodney King case is obviously the case that is most dear and most memorable and most exciting. Lawyers rarely get a chance to have a case that is memorable and nationwide that they're involved in. And I happen to have that opportunity to do the Rodney King civil trial. And that certainly was a case that not only would it open my eyes in terms of the level of systematic brutality that was existing in the city of Los Angeles, but also demonstrated that a case can be used to bring about change for the next generation or the next period of time. And what came out of that case was the Christopher Report. The Christopher Report was important because that said that a case can be used to reform a department. And that was one of the first cases, certainly in California, where that took place. And so that was important in terms of my own involvement and sort of a greening, if you will, and opening up my eyesight as to what the possibilities could be. And I used that case, and that was 40 years ago now. It's being talked about now only because of what happened in Memphis. But and certainly I use that case as a barometer of the changes that have occurred in policing and police misconduct cases and evaluations since the Rodney King case, which I can talk a lot more about in the future, but certainly as a highlight of a case that can be, that certainly was a highlight. Of course, I've represented other people that have been tremendously impactful, and some of which that are well known, some of which are not. You know, the Mario Woods case in San Francisco is a well-known case. Oscar Grant case, you know, that they made a movie out of, the Fruitvale Station, was a historically significant case. And of course, I've represented the rapper Tupac Shakur, which was a very interesting, challenging case. Not only was it he was a challenging person, I mean, he was a talent, but when you're dealing with stars like that, they kind of have their own notion about how the system works. And so I had to work my way through to get him to appreciate that this is really a case, and that you have to participate in the process the way I want you to participate, not the way you want to participate. But that's just a highlight. That case was not significant in the sense that it moved the social justice reform, other than the fact that the officers who were involved in him, I've been trying to sue those guys for a long time. And that allowed me to use this case to sue those guys. And ultimately, those two officers left the department shortly thereafter. So there's a lot more to talk about in terms of reform and how important it is. And I'll be glad to talk about that and answer any questions as time goes on. But that's just a brief look. Okay.
Thank you, John. Chief Manheimer?
Yes, hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, Okay, that's great. I'm so excited I can predate John Burris in a couple of things. Rodney King was about halfway through my career. So I started in policing about 38 or 39 years ago. So please, no one do the math. But I came up and I was actually weaned in the San Francisco Police Department in their first consent decree. So not only they had just been sued by Officers for Justice, the minorities, women sort of were a beneficiary of that suit as well. And what the San Francisco Police Department had to do in 1983, 84 was open the floodgates to diversity in hiring and diversity in practices. And the first consent decree, I think one of the first in the country, and I was kind of weaned on that consent decree. So as I came into the San Francisco Police Department, kind of not only as an other, if you will, a different voice, sort of the first rank of women in every rank I was at, and I went through captain in the San Francisco Police Department, but also under a series of reforms back in 1983, 84, where I actually got to both administer some of them and see the good, the bad, and the ugly, as I will call it, of police reform. Because one of my experiences has been, and I'll talk a little bit more about my career, but that you cannot simply impose something from outside an organization and really be successful in the short term. If you want to create generational change and sort of wait for the new generations to come in, that's one thing. But really, truly to effectuate reform and the type of climate and cultural changes you need to see, those need to be done working with the stakeholders within the department, as well as within the many different communities. So I was lucky to spend, I think, of all of the different departments I was in, some really wonderful time with San Francisco Police Department at a time when they were really just sort of crudely working with reforms. Rodney King came along, and I then I was recruited as the chief in San Mateo. I was there for quite a while. And as I retired, I got tapped to come back to the Oakland Police Department. We thought it was going to be for a few months, and the bottom fell out. The Grand Princess docked in Oakland, if you'll recall, probably the first taste of COVID in the entire country. And from there on in, it was George Floyd moments, and then reform. And then we really got into quite a year. I learned as much as I think I was able to accomplish there. I'm so glad that I had that experience. There's something very special about Oakland. Oakland is very real, and there are many, many different communities and entities. I think John and I will probably get into a couple of those working together. But believe it or not, John Burris, who is a plaintiff's attorney who sued during the Riders case, and I, as the chief, were actually aligned and worked together on several very important reforms within the department. As John mentioned, internally, and I kind of referenced with climate and culture, we have to internally also change that culture and model what it is that you expect the department to be doing in terms of both accountability, equity, fairness, and justice internally, so that they can then provide that externally and be held accountable. So I had some very incredible experiences in Oakland. I'm happy to talk about those later in terms of the reforms that we did enact and some of the reimagining and the transformational changes that I think policing is facing right now in this moment. And I ended up spending a couple of months in San Leandro. And to me, that really capped off my career, because San Leandro was just going into a type of oversight where we really got to work together, the advocates, the community, the administration, and the police department, on what that oversight would look like. And I think we put together a model once we were able to break through and get all of the stakeholders to the table. I think I had to really remind people quite a bit that you cannot just imprint and you cannot leave us out of the table, because if you do, you're really not going to be able to impact the way you want to with reforms. And so we were at the table. I think that model of reform and oversight that we put in San Leandro is one that is being modeled across the state of California. So I'm really pleased with that. And I'll end up with this, because If you asked me what police reform was, and certainly now in my role with the Department of Justice, where I oversee agencies that have high crime, and I lead teams into those agencies to ensure that the type of work we're doing aligns with the community, does not further harm those communities, like you mentioned earlier, hotspots policing and some of those other tactics and strategies that we now know do bring harms to communities, and work together with the community. So I think, to me, what police reform and transformation really means is, how do we effectuate and co-produce safety with the very communities who expect to be safe around us, the police? And that, for me, is the bottom line. What's the best outcome? Communities are not monolithic. Advocates don't speak for all of the different communities. As a police chief, I expect to be able to deliver on safety, but also to deliver that trust that people will feel safe around our police. That's the bottom line for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. The next question is for Diana. Can you tell us a little bit more about the Police Accountability Office and what your work there entails, and what you believe needs to change in order for more police accountability to be possible?
Yes, thank you. So the Department of Police Accountability, as I said, was formerly the Office of Citizens Complaints. And then in 2016, 2017, there were a lot of changes made both to the San Francisco Charter and to, San Francisco police as well underwent a number of scandals and almost ended up under a consent decree. Instead, the U.S. Department of Justice created what's commonly known as the COPS report, which provided 272 recommendations to the San Francisco Police Department on how to reform the department and how to prevent the scandals from happening. And out of that report and that era came significant changes both in my department and at the San Francisco Police Department. That is when our name changed and our mandate changed. We now are responsible for three main duties. We are a civilian oversight agency, and our job is to, first and foremost, investigate all complaints against sworn members of the San Francisco Police Department that are brought to us by civilians. We investigate and make recommendations about whether officers engaged in misconduct, and if they did, what type of discipline they should face as a result of that misconduct. We are also instrumental in revising and creating policies that govern how San Franciscans are policed by the San Francisco Police Department. When we first started this, and in 2016, one of the main recommendations was that our office engage with the community and with the San Francisco Police Department to update their general orders, which are basically the policies for how San Francisco police officers are to conduct themselves on a daily basis. When we came in back then, and even to this day, we are working on revising policies that were written in 1994. One example of a policy I'm currently working on has to do with how officers should process property. And to me, it's just so funny because it literally was created before the creation of smartphones. And one of the biggest fights we're having is how do we engage, how do we create policy for officers when dealing with smartphones that take into consideration all of the current legislation and legal precedent that's available? Because right now, the policy that governs how they are to seize, to confiscate and store cell phones is non-existent, because that policy existed before cell phones were created. Just one example of the type of policies that we are revising and updating. We are still, even though it was in 2016, working on finishing implementing the 272 recommendations from the DOJ COPS report in the policy division of our office. We also are the charter mandate that was changed in 2016 also now requires us to conduct periodic audits of the San Francisco Police Department and policies. So, for example, we are currently conducting an audit into whether the bias audit system is working in San Francisco. We had a racist text scandal a few years ago, some of you may be familiar with, and it was determined that San Francisco did not have a good system of auditing its electronic media and identifying officers who were engaging in bias, racist texting and exchange of information. So in response, SFPD created a list of bias words it uses this list to audit officers' electronic media, emails, cell phones, their MVTs, et cetera. But we are realizing in the audit that the manner in which they're doing it, which is mostly manual, is giving a lot of false positives and is just not efficient, an efficient way of identifying the bias that may exist in electronic communications. So hopefully once that audit is done, we will present it to the Police Commission and effectuate change to make sure that when we are conducting, or when SFPD is conducting these types of audits, that they are actually getting to the root of the problem. So those are kind of our three core functions at the Department of Police Accountability: investigating officers for wrongdoing, determining if someone has done something wrong, and prosecuting, for lack of a better term, discipline with either the Chief of Police or the Police Commission, and involved in the creation and revision of policies. I forgot what the other question you asked me. So that's a little bit of what we do. In addition, in terms of effective police reform, what have we done? My team has led in the updating of numerous general orders and numerous training and department notice policies. Most recently, we've done something extremely controversial, and we are the only city that I know of in San Francisco that's currently doing this, but we are in the process of implementing a general order that is going to prohibit the use of pretext stops. And for those that don't know why this is important, you know, the data and the anecdotal data and the actual analytical data proves that people in communities of color are stopped for basic traffic violations that have to do with equipment violations, you know, having an expired registration tab, not having a light over your license plate, equipment violations at a very high rate. And those types of traffic stops are used as a ruse, so to speak, or a pretext to rummage around a person's car, if possible, by police, and to basically find evidence of other wrongdoing. In other words, officers will pull people over and ask a set of questions, look into the car, and try to find other reasons to incriminate the driver. And what the data has shown is that when officers do this, it doesn't necessarily result in public safety. And what it does do is create animosity and distrust in communities of color. It's another one of those examples where when you look at the data and when you look at the history, you realize that this type of policing really isn't helping in terms of public safety and needs to be addressed. There's been a lot of pushback from various people, organizations, et cetera, but we are hopeful to implement this policy and at least really truly create a situation where we can compare the numbers. Reform requires us to look at what is working, what isn't working, and trying something different and seeing if that difference works. And that is a good example of let's see what's going to happen. Let's see if public safety is truly effective. If officers can't stop people for not having a taillight. The other thing that we've been working diligently on that is causing a lot of consternation, but also is extremely important in my opinion, is disclosing our records of misconduct based on the new statutory requirements of SB 16 and SB 1421. It's a new era in police reform. For years, our work has been done and cloaked in secrecy. When an officer is disciplined, nobody knows about it except for that officer in that department. And we are finally at a place at DPA where we are fighting, but I think albeit very successfully, to disclose those past records that we have of officer misconduct. More needs to be done. I think that in order to continue this type of work, there are three things that are extremely important that we as an agency need, and that is community involvement and investment in the type of work we're doing. We need access to information, which is something that we are constantly fighting for, and we need financial support. SFPD's budget is $700 million. Ours is a little under 10 million. And we are required to oversee about 1,500 officers. So that's a little bit about our department and how we do our job and what we do.
Thanks, Diana. Susan, can you tell us a little bit from your perspective as a police chief, what are some of the specific challenges that you come across that are specific to the role as the leader of the police department?
Yeah, and you know, as a police chief, you're not really just a leader of the men and women that you serve and deploy throughout your community to co-produce safety, right? You are also responsible and answerable to many communities, all of the communities, and I've been in 4 very diverse cities, very different cities, and those communities have a plethora of different interests, right? And so we are responsible to provide both safety and efficacy in doing so in a way that's procedurally just and constitutionally correct policing. So I want to talk just a little bit to go off of what our amazing San Francisco Police Office of Accountability is addressing, because there are so many questions around this. You talked a little bit about the blowback. I just want to go right to it. Okay, there are all of these questions. There is no question in my mind that with 800,000 police officers in the country, 18,000 police agencies, there are many, and I have that vantage point across the country, that need absolute transformation and that really are, I mean, I'm aghast at some of what I've seen. And with body worn camera now, this replays ubiquitously over our live at 5, 7, 9, 11, and 12 news every night. But frankly, here in the Bay Area, I do believe that we are sensitized. We have transformative mandates from our community, who now that they see what's going on through body worn camera and through really a much more intrusive news cycle, it really does require us to sit down with our communities more at the micro level. Policing is a very, very personal relationship between the communities they serve and the community and the police department and the men and women that they are. And I think that there are many different interests within the community. And the way you really get to that, the personal policing that a community wants, tolerates, and ensuring that we're aligned with those constitutional practices, is by sitting around the table together. And I'll give you a for instance. Let's go and talk about this idea of pretextual stops, which are the traffic stops you're talking about. There is no question that you might be focused in a certain area, and that area may be a higher crime area, which unfortunately in many of our communities might also coincide with challenged communities and communities of color. But don't they also deserve the traffic safety safety and the type of policing that every other community deserves. And I will tell you right now in Oakland, when we looked at pretextual stops, and John, you'll know this, we had communities of color really backlash against that because they felt that they needed traffic safety just as much as everybody else did. So we got to it a different way, and I really liked the way we got to it. And the only way we got to it was when we sat down together and said, it's not an either or. It's not advocates versus data. It's an and. And that and in the middle there is, what are the interests around it? The interests around it is that we don't harm communities of color by intrusively and unconstitutionally focusing into neighborhoods that then is it is something that is seen as an expanse of our power and is seen as targeting racially profiling individuals. But sitting down and looking at where are the key traffic safety issues, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but and what are the causative factors around those, and letting our officers know you're going to go out and provide traffic safety through these three causative factors, which we know are the ones that are causing the accidents in this neighborhood, then I think you get to the interests of everyone. But the only way you get to those interests is by sitting down together and not becoming ideological about it, and really listening to your subject matter experts in policing as well, who hopefully are not defensively at the table and are open to recognizing the harms that just really throughout time we have visited through being an extension of policies that have been racist and that have been really harmful in the past. And once we all sit down together, hopefully coming up with those policies where we can all effectuate safety and security together. And I want to reference something that John Burris did that I, and he knows I worked very, very hard to meet this goal. When John and Jim Chain and the plaintiff's attorneys for Oakland recognized that internally in the police department, the Oakland Police Department, there was discriminatory bias in discipline. And what happened was, because the OPD is under the type of reform mandates, they actually did a study on this, found out that in fact it was true. And John, I don't know, you may speak to this or not, but it was really, John really, I know, cared deeply about this issue. And as I came in as chief, I vowed and we pledged to work together to address that discrimination, because at the end of the day, procedural justice has to be something that, if you're going to tout it, expect it, and hold accountability to it, you also have to model it internally within your own internal community. And it's something we work long and hard on. So my bottom line in all this is, there of those 18,000 agencies, the communities, the values, and the leadership within your city, your department, your leaders, your subject matter experts in policing need to be something that you align with, vow to both transform and ensure constitutional policing, and then work on it together. Do not exclude the police from those discussions, because imprinting and externally imposing reform, I tell you, just as a chief for 38 years, really believing in transformation and reform will be long coming if you do it that way. Thanks.
Thanks, Susan. John, can you share from your perspective, what are some of the most prevalent questions that are facing those that are fighting on the civilian side for reform? And you'll just need to unmute.
I think that both Diana and Susan certainly have captured the challenges that are presented. I have been involved in ways that I had a chance to look at a department from the very beginning and rewrite the policies and participate in rewriting those policies that I think that were important. And certainly from a civilian's point of view, what I looked at and always looks at is, how is the community being affected by what the police are doing? Because that's the part that's important. So for me, and what I focused in on clearly was the issue of racial profiling. racial profiling, as both Susan and Diane have talked about it, that goes to the stopping of people, in my view, without just cause, without probable cause. And you can, or you can have a minor basis for the pretextual issues that we have. And so what we had eventually, from the community's point of view, constantly protesting, me having experienced this because I had many cases where people were stopped for very minor reasons, and ultimately, as I referred to it, they get stopped. They question why they're being stopped. They argue about it. Next thing you know, they are in jail. Their car is towed. They got to get a police or somebody to represent them, and there's substantial collateral damage. And so, from a community point of view, I want to stop the collateral damage that happens to individuals on a daily routine basis. And that comes from the whole issues of stops. That's the very initial. There's no one trying to prevent criminals, freedom of criminals, or the police trying to investigate people who engage in misconduct. The problem is if there's a dragnet and a lot of people get swept up in that without probable cause, or because the police decide that they don't really respect this community. So what we did in order to deal with it from the community's point of view, because it's easy to talk about racial profiling and things of that nature, but if you don't have any real data to support it, then it's sort of like an empty kind of comment. It's arguments that are being made that have no basis. So what we were able to do in Oakland, and it took a number of years to do this, we put together the Stop Data program. The Stop Data meaning every officer had to record information about the person they had stopped. That's the race, sex, gender, basis for the stop, et cetera, et cetera. And then what we did was, and it took a number of years for this to happen. It took Professor Eberhard from Stanford and her staff to come in and help analyze the data that was accumulated. But what we did find, which is what we all know now, and I think the data supports it, that African Americans were being stopped at a disproportionately high rate. Even if you control for crime, the numbers themselves were totally high. And likewise, the other thing we found is that they were being searched first, they've been handcuffed, and they were talked to in a nasty way. All of which was like going to the relationship that the community had with the police, and caused bad humor and bad relationships to develop as a consequence of it. So a lot of emphasis was placed upon that, and what we did is get this data to then focus, once the data established the mistreatment and the disparities, to then have focus groups to go back then and talk to these officers to figure out what it was that was causing this. And there was a lot of work done around that. And so the numbers have gone down substantially. And this is from a community point of view, because it's the community that are the ones that are affected by this. And they're the ones that are being stopped wrongfully. They're the ones that are being handcuffed. And when we found that white officers were not handcuffing necessarily white people, they were only handcuffing Black people, and the Black officers were not handcuffing white folks. And so we found that there were these disparities that existed that no one talked about. So it was, the reform issues were, from a community's point of view, was extraordinarily important for the community to see that real progress was being made, and that they weren't being stopped and they weren't being charged in a manner which they had done before, which was critical from their point of view. The other thing that I always had mindful of, and as a consequence of doing discriminatory work as well, I had represented police officers down through the years, and I had this sense that the Black officers were being discriminated against within the department on the issues of discipline. And I didn't say this initially, but when we did the reform on this case, we put together a list of 52 to 55 different tasks. And those tasks really said the department had to make these kind of changes, which then meant we had to ourselves to participate in the rewriting of these particular general orders and various programs in order for the department to get in compliance. Unfortunately, that has not happened. But one of the areas that was extraordinarily important was the consistency of discipline. And because our view was, if you don't treat the individual officers in your department well, what makes us think you're going to treat the people in the community well? And we figured that, one, it was important for the officers to know they had to, within the department itself, and which is, you know, as Susan will tell you, and Diane probably knows, there's a lot of cliques within these departments. And the cliques come about because people go up together, they come in at the same time, and they're friends. And as a consequence of that, when friends get promoted, others they take care of each other. And as a consequence of that, the Black employees, the data was always believed, that they themselves were being discriminated against. They were being charged more often and more serious offenses, and they were ultimately being fired and terminated. So we want to take a good look at that, and which we have done. And as a consequence of that, over this period of time after having this study being initiated, now there's things in process to evaluate how this is happening. And we're now seeing that the racial issue is less of a problem, although still it's not necessarily not a problem, but it's a less of a problem than it was before. Those are areas that I think that we really are having to continue to work. The other areas that, from a foreign point of view, from the community's point of view, they obviously want to see less shooting of unarmed people. And this was important because Oakland was averaging 7 to 9 shootings annually. Some of those were people who were shot and killed who were unarmed, or even if they were killed under questionable circumstances. Because my argument was, just because a person has a knife and or a gun, that doesn't mean you get to kill them. The question is, what did they do that would justify the use of deadly force? And so a lot of effort was made in looking at that. We developed the executive review board, as Susan knows, that really caused us to reevaluate those. And for example, I had cases where a person might be asleep in the yard or sleep in a car, but he has a gun on him, and the police come up and wake him up and then kill him. Well, we developed a new policy around that in terms of what's the strategy for handling those kind of things. So they're very important. Likewise, from the community's point of view, the issue of how do you handle the mentally impaired? Because each of us, we all know that mentally impaired people are out on the street. They're acting in ways that they don't necessarily respond to normal complaints and normal commands, and they wind up being killed. And so we wanted to figure out how to do that. So a lot of effort was made in trying to rewrite policies and redirect training so that department and officers do know how to handle mentally impaired people without actually having to kill them, but being able to bring them under control and provide services for them. Those are just aspects from a community's point of view that it's important, because all of this doesn't really matter if the community itself doesn't respect what is taking place. Now, part of that is a police commission that was then formulated, not as sophisticated, I don't think, and successful as the one that San Francisco had, but it is a step in the direction that says the department is going to be monitored and looked at more closely by an independent group, which I think is important for the police, because the fundamental question that I'm always asking, and people are asked constantly, who polices the police? Or can we trust the police to police themselves? And that depends. It really, the evidence suggests it depends. If friends are being involved, no. But if they're just some other person and the community, yes, they can. But they don't. If friends are involved, then you have to have another process in place to insulate friends from policing each other. Because if you do that, the base instincts of friendships and relationships will overcome their objectivity. So those are the kind of things that go to the issue of reform. We had a task of 55 of them. We've so far gotten just about all but one, and the one that we haven't got done is the one that caused the police chief to be fired last week, in large measure because of the failure of the system in place to adequately investigate itself. Which is, as I referred to it today more recently, there's a hole in the ship, and the ship will sink if you don't cover that hole up. And part of that hole is the ability objectively for police to police themselves.
Thanks, John. So we have one more question that will be given to all of the panelists, and whoever wants to chime in first, you can just unmute yourself and go, but you'll all have a chance to respond. And then we'll have some chance for audience Q&A. And essentially, I shared our questions with the panelists in advance. I didn't really share this question, but essentially, you all have given some great examples of what has been happening, what you have personally been doing, what's been, tried. And I guess what I'm really sitting here with is just why is it so hard? It sounds like there are a lot of solutions, but we still haven't, and things that are being tried, but we still haven't, conquered this issue as a society and within our specific municipalities. And, some of the questions that come up, people wonder, is it a culture shift question? Is it a policy shift question? So just generally, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Why is it so hard? What are the key things that we haven't figured out yet?
Well, change is hard in departments. Culture is deeply ingrained, and changing that culture is the ultimate challenge. And if you're trying to do that, then you have to have leadership at the top that has to come really from the public officials through the police chief, through the command staff, and holding officers accountable. These are not consistently done. And as a consequence, you will find that the effort to do so doesn't work easily. And on top of that, to be real clear, there's a police union. And some cities are more powerful than others, but police unions are a true stumbling block in many ways in trying to get true reform. I don't know if you saw up in Vallejo that the union up there had a vote of no confidence for the chief, who was desperately trying to bring about reform. They had all these killings up there. So now for us in Oakland, we've been able to work with the police union, which is, in a consistent way. But the reason being is we promise not to mess with the MOU. If you start messing with their salaries and their income, I can assure you, they will resist you at every level along the way. And in San Francisco, Diana can speak to that more so, but I have cases that go to the San Francisco that's not opposed by the San Francisco Union. And so I know that they're a resistant group. And it's certainly that way in most cities that I deal with. And often, and before you can get something done, the police chief has to check with the union. And the union had veto power over a lot of this conduct. So that's my perspective and challenge.
I agree that unions can be very, and I'm a union representative, so I'm on the executive board for the Municipal Attorneys Association. So I am extremely pro-union. But, I agree with John that the police officers associations in our different counties and associated with law enforcement do present a very challenging hurdle to implementing reform because they stand in the way of officer buy-in. And I think that the biggest, to me, it seems very simplistic, actually. What stands in the way of true reform is the officers and the community's inability to admit when they're wrong. Officers will not admit when they've done something wrong. They will fight tooth and nail to preserve the status quo. And the same for the community. There are extremists in the community as well who, defunding the police is not realistic. We need officers. We just need a different type of officer. And the same thing for officers. They need to come to the table and understand what it feels like and stand in the shoes of the community who feel like they are an occupying force sometimes, and not look at it as, I'm doing this for your own good. You want policing, right? So this is how you get it. You don't get to pick and choose how you're going to be policed because this is the only way and this is the best way. What we need is for both for officer buy-in to reform, which does not happen very easily on the rank and file. I mean, we in San Francisco have come very close to that situation that John talked about in Vallejo. And our chief definitely has to strike a very delicate balance, and he walks a very delicate balance every day, trying to get officer buy-in to the reforms that we recommend, and at the same time, appeasing the community who wants more at every step of the way. And I think that if that's the key to police reform, striking that balance and having officers come to the table and be honest about what they see every day and what bothers them. And when they do make a mistake, admitting it, and the community also taking ownership for some of the things that they are shielding their community from, like, being real that, yeah, crime's a problem and I need to be responsible for helping in certain situations. The don't snitch policy may not work for everybody under all circumstances. Maybe it's time to cooperate with the police if I truly want officers to be able to solve certain crimes. So, to me, it's just that simple, is that both sides have to be honest with each other, and both sides have to be open and listen to each other and be willing to give certain recommendations a try. It may feel uncomfortable, it may not work, and that's okay too, but we've got to try something new, because here we are, and there's going, Tyree Nichols, there's going to be another Tyree Nichols, there's going to be another George Floyd. And it's mostly because we literally cannot come together as a community and create priorities, become more efficient in how we use the 911 system, because that is a huge problem. We have so many people calling 911 for non-emergency services that tie up police officers. And if you want policing to be effective and public safety to be effective, you got to stop calling 911 because you're mad at your neighbor, unless your neighbor poses a threat. We have to start thinking outside the box about how to enforce certain traffic enforcement. Yeah, traffic enforcement is an important part of policing. We should be enforcing certain laws, speeding, running red lights, running stop signs, but we don't need officers to do that necessarily. And we don't need officers to enforce some of the laws that are currently on the books that really do not make us more safe. Whether someone has a light over their license plate is not making us safe as a community. I would much rather have that officer concentrate on responding to an A priority call, which is basically, assaultive behavior or something super important. I'd much rather him be available to do that instead of pulling someone over and giving them a ticket or doing an investigation, and that takes them out of the rotation to be able to respond to something more important. So that's, I think, kind of where we can do better as a society. We also need to, go ahead.
I'm just going to say the one thing you can't be dismissive of is that police lie. They lie often, and they have an agenda to get whatever they're trying to get done. And they will lie about individuals, what they've done, or they increase the charges, or they will punish people unnecessarily so. And I have them all the time when you have people stopped for nonsense like you've talked about, and then if they search them, they want to search their cars, they don't like it, they get arrested, they get pulled out of the car, put down on the ground, embarrassed, handcuffed, sent to jail. The woman in the car has to sit out on the street, they tow the car away. Those kind of things happen with a great deal of regularity, and it's very harmful to the community, and you can't expect the community to like you if you treat them in a disrespectful way. So there has to be some policy on the part of the department that says, we're not going to accept that type of conduct, and officers who engage in it are going to be held accountable for it. Because if the accountability isn't there, then officers will do as they please, and the community will suffer along the way.
I want to give Susan a chance to give her
Thank
thoughts.
you.
Diana, did you? I want to
Sorry,
give you a
Susan.
chance to respond quickly to what John just offered.
Well, it's interesting that John said that, because, for example, in San Francisco, one of the policies that Chief Scott tried to implement is not requiring officers. Officers often sit people down on the curb,
Yeah.
and people think that's and people in the community complain about that and say that's extremely disrespectful and it's not necessarily necessary for safety. And he did try to implement that, and it's a perfect example of where the union stepped in and that thing was dead on arrival.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to say that's interesting that you mentioned that. I wouldn't go as far as to say, that officers lie. I think so many officers.
They lie. Okay, please don't tell me. Okay, don't tell me.
Yeah. Okay. Some do.
I want to say all don't lie. Okay?
Right.
But many do. Okay.
it's going to require a cultural shift. They have to understand that it's okay to be who they want to be. I truly believe that officers want to be better, but many of them are just afraid to take that step and speak up because they're going to be a party of one. They'll be ostracized by their community. And I worry about that. And, that's why it's got to be a cultural shift, and everybody has to be honest.
Thank you. I want to give Susan a few minutes if you have some thoughts to add to this question.
I do. I'd like to take the next half hour if you don't mind.
Not sure if we have a half hour, but
Okay.
how about
Okay.
3 minutes?
Okay.
Is that
Let me just say this about all of this. If police don't feel safe in the policing they're doing, it's worse for everybody. That's when we get overreaction. That's when we get curbing people on the sidewalk. And that's what comes of policies that aren't informed and not defensive or obstructed, but are not formed with understanding some of the impacts and some of the absolute collateral issues around some of these policies. And John, you know this. There was a policy that the Oakland Police Commission tried to, in fact, copy New York Police Department with no sit, lie, stand on any portion of any person's, I think, from their head down to their knees. And what I tried to say was, I walk the footbeat. You can't tell it because I look tall in all my Zooms. I do this on purpose, but I'm about 5'3" on a good day, okay? I walk the footbeat on Mission Street. I walk the footbeat in the Tenderloin. I walk the footbeat a lot of places. And I did de-escalate and I did all that I could. It is very dangerous out there on the streets. And I tried to show the police commission, I brought them in, we tackled some of our command staff, but as a small woman, if I don't have the basic tools to actually do that job in the right way, it's going to cause me to escalate to higher level impact uses of force. So what we have to do is really sit down and understand what it is that we're looking to reform, and is this actually the best outcome for what we're doing? Because if the police don't feel that they have cover out there to go home at night, then they're going to overreact and we're going to get more shootings. So let's look at some of the real policies that have been substantive. Let's kind of put together a best practices manual. And I've been asking this, I work with the Department of Justice. There are just scattershot reform policies, some of which are pretty dangerous, not just to the police, but to the outcomes that they're looking for at the end of the day. I will say 5 that in the state of California have through the legislature been pretty significant. And I want to recognize those: decertification of police officers for specified complaints, mandated collecting of RIPA data, which you talked about earlier, because John is right. Once you know the data like Oakland did, they were able to bring down disparate contacts incredibly, and they really did it through the data. Mandatory public records release and timelines for officer involved shootings, mandatory release for officers' investigations of misconduct, mandatory independent state attorney's office, right, John? So no friends versus friends on all officer involved shootings where they have the first right. The corollary and the other side of that is that we are seeing extreme levels of gun violence in our urban centers. And Oakland is no stranger to that, as are a lot of other East Bay cities. So when they ask me, why are police shootings going up? And by the way, I don't want to jinx it, John, but we've been doing pretty well in Oakland for a couple of years. But I talk about the plethora of guns out there and the fact that officers now are under such intense scrutiny for each and every action that they make, that at times they're going to want to not be that next viral video on their body-worn camera. And they're going to start turning away some from policing if we don't ensure that those reforms that we put in place for very valid reasons are not ones that also ensure that the officer and the community are both safe for the outcomes of those. So I just want to put that out there because I think that there are many reasonable reforms, but policing aren't the only levers. The criminal justice system has fairly a lot of components. And when we look at reimagining policing, which I did in both Oakland and in San Leandro, we came up with some great ideas that have yet to be implemented because police as only one component of the entire throughput of the response mechanism. I mean, do you think any officer wants to go to a mental health crisis? Any officer you've ever met wants to go to someone in a mental health crisis because all we frankly have are the tools on our belt. No, we would like actually the mental health failed system to actually respond to those. And there are some good efforts afoot, right? There's some initiative right now, but we are not seeing with all the defund, reimagine, and reform, the other parts of this failed systems step up. And so we end up being that default, as you talked about earlier, that we are just the 911 default system for every failed other system. And so I would like us to come to the table and say, if we could wave our magic wand, we wouldn't want all those 911 calls, but I'll tell you this, don't take away my button to deploy an officer there when you don't have any other backup for them to go to. Tell me who will go to these. So I think reform is not just pulling the police lever. It's got to look at all the other failed systems that end up where police are the default, everything, because we get into these situations where we cannot get out of them without force. And of course, I think at the end of the day, we do have to recognize that we have officers who are not at this point wanting to stay in this profession. Now, some self-selection is great. Yes, you have to have informed leaders who are going to embrace transformation, align with the community values and vision, and ensure constitutional policing and accountability. I'm not arguing any of that. I'm just saying that we need those reforms to be meaningful and to be just and equitable internally as well.
Susan, let me ask this one point here. I don't think in any of the reform efforts that we made and sought to make in Oakland that did not give due consideration to officer safety. Officers who were involved in promoting those particular reforms, we write them, but we gave due consideration to what they had to say about safety, because I don't think any of us wanted to jeopardize officer safety, just want to make sure that there were maybe other avenues that might be available to them. But officer safety was never, ever one that was jeopardized or called into question at any point in time during our efforts at reform.
John, I believe that
I'll give you a chance to respond to that, and then we have an audience question.
All right, sorry.
Okay. I do believe that you and Jim Chanin, as the plaintiff's attorneys and as community representatives, have always been very, very responsive to the men and women of the Oakland Police Department and how that impacts them as well as the community. I think the main sad and very grievous point of the reforms in Oakland has been that there's not the administrative bandwidth. So it takes all the officers and sergeants and everyone else off the streets when they should be out there doing the work and doing the supervision. So that's I think the issue. I think the reforms that have been done in Oakland have been done with them in mind. Not as much from the police commission, because I think they have a learning curve.
They're learning.
So
Okay.
we do have a few audience questions, and we'll try to get to as many as we can with the time that we have left. So the first question we have is, a number of you have referenced diversity in hiring and how that is a piece of this conversation as well. And yet at the same time, we're reminded by events like the tragic killing of Tyre Nichols in Memphis, who was killed by a group of Black officers, that's not just having more diversity in hiring is not going to solve anything in and of itself. So can you all just offer some thoughts either about, that the killing of Tyre Nichols and how that the response to that has impacted your work, or this idea of, that both the opportunities, but also limits and challenges of the conversation about diversity in hiring.
Let me go quickly to that. Number one, I've always had a view that Black officers can be just as bad as white officers. I mean, that's been the case, although I think I've always said I'd rather have them than not. But I think the issue on Tyree Rail's case is the special forces that exist. Part of it, if you have these special units that sometimes are not controlled and do not operate in the same way that other units that are under the sergeants and lieutenants and things of that nature. And those are the people who are really dangerous. And in our case in Oakland, that was the exact crew. We had a crew, the riders, as they referred to them, who operated separately, and they had seemed to have gotten some sanction from above, from the at that point in time, we think it was the mayor, but who kind of gave a stamp of approval. Well, likewise, we had the same thing in Memphis. There you had this special group that was kind of out of control. So I think we have to be concerned that the diversity cannot just be racial, but it also has to be in terms of the assignments that are given to officers and who's in charge of those people. So there's something to be said for all of that, but assignments and training and supervision count a lot.
Diana or Susan, do you have anything to add?
Maybe I'll go quickly. Every one of these horrific incidents, I mean, we in policing are as horrified, if not more so, to watch the murder in George Floyd, to watch this Tyre Nichols. It is horrifying and unbelievable to us. Particularly, I'm usually with California police chiefs. I train all of the incoming police chiefs in California. I want to say they're a younger generation. They are looking and struggling to align with and be more transformative. But we see an incident like that, we are all painted with that brush. It sets us back in our communities, and it's horrific. I just need to say that first and foremost. I think secondly, for the diversity, the special units, John, you're exactly right. I've been in special units a big part of my life, crime suppression teams. The ratio is 2 or 3 per supervisor, and getting them out of those units as soon as you can, because they get so frustrated with the lack of accountability of the rest of the criminal justice system to deal with some of these individuals that, it's certainly no excuse, and it's horrific, but the burnout factor is quite a bit. So I think that's what we learned there. But I just want to say there are going to be these incidents with ubiquitous body camera, and we all take a big step backward. But if we use that as a way to really do that deep look within, you don't think there's a police agency in the country that didn't start talking about their special unit policy after that? Let me tell you differently, I think they are. And so I think we've got to take all these incidents and have that discussion internally, have that discussion with our communities, and look to learn from those.
So
I do want to say very quickly, representation matters. Representation matters. I have been going to all the stations doing roll call training as part of some reform initiatives that we have rolled out, where I basically go along with a representative from Internal Affairs to talk to officers about what to expect when they're facing a discipline case and what the trends are, what officers are getting in trouble for. And it warmed my heart to go to Bayview Station. I'm a Bayview resident. I've lived here for over 20 years. And when I looked out at the sea of multicultural faces, I was so excited and proud of Chief Scott for making sure that our department is staffed with people from all different walks of life. With that said, that's not a guarantee or a Band-Aid, because people are who they are. There are also there's a lot of people pleasing and a lot of fitting in for safety reasons and for a number of social reasons that officers face internally. And they do want to fit in, and they want to be accepted, and they want to be protected more than anything else. And I think that when we see situations like Tyre Nichols, that's where that's coming from. And so we need to do a really good job of supporting and empowering our people of color in the policing community, and to make sure that they're heard when they are willing to step up, and that they're also disciplined when things like this happen. But I completely agree. We are having tremendous difficulties in San Francisco with certain these special departments, or including CJIC and SVRT. They definitely operate under a different system, and it's a problem.
So another question, this might be our last question, is about the influence of things like technology and new technologies. And so that could be, there's been talk of arming police robots, for example, or even the impact of how police are using data, right? And I know, Diana, earlier you had talked about the change in policy about how police are dealing with, collecting people's cell phones. So can you just talk about how things like, how fast technology changes, or some of those technology changes, are affecting efforts at reform?
Well, the most significant thing that's happened over the last 20 years has been the video body-worn cameras and cell phones. I mean, frankly, that has changed the paradigm completely. And we certainly made sure in our case in Oakland that was going to be something that was going to be worked through. But I think gathering of data in different ways is important. And certainly there may be things around robots and things of that nature, which I don't agree with, because you can't, some of this is still human. Policing is about human beings. And so I'd be mindful of entrusting anything like that to a robot of some kind. But I do think we should be mindful and open for new technology as it develops, and if it can improve. I mean, for example, tasers was a new technology that took place, 20 years ago, Susan? I don't know how long ago it was, but it is huge. It is huge. And certainly we had a number of cases out of it, but I actually prefer it to be used as opposed to a gun. And, and so I've seen people's lives being saved. On the other hand, I've actually sued people because they should have used the taser and they used the gun. So new technology we should be open to and see how it improves the quality of policing and the community representation. So I'm clearly open for it as it develops. I don't know what it is, but whenever it happens, I'm for it. To look at it, I should say, review it.
I think, again, it's a matter of being honest with the community and not trying to do things. What happens in the dark always comes to light, and the killer robots is a perfect example of what happened in San Francisco, where SFPD tried to do something in the dark, and somebody with great public, relations speaking skills was able to spin that and, label them as killer robots. And SFPD was left scrambling. Had they been upfront with the community and really explained to the community and took the time to get the community to buy into the necessity of these particular robots, we might be in a different situation, but they didn't. They tried to, nod, wink, wink, hurry up and let's move this along so that nobody's watching. And one person was awake, basically, not asleep at the wheel, and made a big stink of it. These particular robots, are they horrible? No, but the problem is that the community wasn't properly apprised of the pros and cons that come with using these type of devices. And that is, I squarely put at SFPD's feet. They did not do a good public relations job of explaining to people what these robots were all about. And that is the same for all of the tools and house. The other issue I think that I want to just lightly hint upon is social media and technologies changing at rapid speeds, and it is very difficult to keep up with policies and procedures to help officers navigate all of these new different aspects of investigation. And we are seeing a lot of officers go rogue and use it for, and find out kind of on the back end. And so I think we need a lot more proactive thinking and discussing of policies when it comes to the use of social media for investigative purposes, because right now what's happening is officers are just going rogue and doing what they want. And then it's up to the courts to decide whether or not what they did was appropriate and within constitutional standards. We need to get ahead of this as a society and as a law enforcement agency, certainly in San Francisco.
Susan, any last thoughts on the?
Yeah, just, it saddens me when I see technologies that can eliminate harm, reduce force, and protect both the officers and the community, because simply technology and Big Brother have such a negative connotation. Again, it's not an either or, it's an and. And, I've seen privacy commissions and technology commissions and unnamed cities in the Bay Area be so biased against any technology that it really is something that would eliminate or reduce force, and that saddens me at times. So I think we just have to look at them from the lens of what does this effectuate, and is the outcome better for the communities and those who police them? That to me is a pretty simple question, but it starts with, again, eliminating your biases and actually looking at, and transparently so. I agree with you fully. Let's get it out there on the table and let's talk about it.
Okay, last question. And if you could all just take no more than 1 minute, just easy question. What makes you hopeful?
Well, for me, history makes me hopeful. Okay. We have come a long way in society here and around the police and issues. And I'm very much a believer that history is such that we keep moving, making progress as new ideas come up, new people come up, younger people come up with better ideas who have a commitment. And I'm a believer in the people that's coming behind us and their commitment to truth and justice and the right things to do. And history tells us that to me is the progress that I can rely upon will come through history. So I'm optimistic because of that.
I think I am hopeful because I do realize, based on my experience, there was a time in my life where I painted officers with the same brush, but really each officer is an individual. And I do truly see that the majority are really working hard and trying to do the right thing. I'm hopeful that, and I hope that moving forward, they will be empowered to call out the bad apples among them, because that will be the game changer that we need. We can all do it as a society, and we have been, and I'm glad that an office like mine exists to make sure that that's happening. But it's the everyday, people always say, well, aren't you jaded? But I see tons of officers who do nothing wrong too. Tons, our sustain rate is 10%, and we're actually the highest in the nation, which actually translates in what I always tell officers, because they get so pissed when I'm around. But that means 90% of you are doing the right thing. Like, we've watched what you've done on body-worn camera. We've analyzed the evidence, and you actually did the right thing. But what you need to do is, with those 10% that are screwing up, you need to call them out too, because we need you to be on the front line of bad officers. So I'm hopeful.
Okay, 37 years in policing, some of the toughest neighborhoods, most of my career. I have incredible hope every day. The resiliency I see in our communities and our young people, in the younger officers and younger leaders coming up to do this work is so critical and important. It is a transformational moment. We can't lose that. We have to continue the initiative to really truly imprint and change this profession. And part of that is the really neat stuff that's coming along the way. The community violence interrupters, the alternatives to incarceration, social and procedural justice. And really what I love is the youth diversion and the alternatives to the schools to prison pipeline. There's a lot of good things going on around the country. We just need to bring them to more agencies, and we really need to make sure We all have our job to do. Our plaintiffs' attorneys, our police accountability, our leaders and our chiefs, and our community as well. But let's all do it with the same goal in mind: safety in the community and safe police doing that safety work. Thank you.
Thank you all. This has been such a wonderful discussion. I myself have learned a lot. I'm sure everyone in the crowd has learned or gained a new perspective. So John, Diana, Susan, thank you so much for giving us your time. And everyone who tuned in, thank you for joining us, and be on the lookout for other events that NCJW will be bringing you to just have this conversation moving forward. So good night.
Yeah, good
Thank
night.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Pleasure meeting you all.
Thank you.